All right, how is everyone tonight? Hopefully, we get a decent crowd here. So just let me know when you can hear me. That way, we can get going here. It looks like we've got a good amount, 10, 12 people in here right now. So the goal of tonight is to kind of reiterate what we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. Looks like Sydney's going to give you guys a Quizlet that you guys can use too, that I'm sure everyone would appreciate. So anyway, let's get going and let's get talking. So we are tomorrow. We had intended it to be kind of a quiz and 35 questions, right? Kind of how similar it had been, but ultimately we had a hard time fitting it into 35 questions, so it did end up being larger. It's going to end up being 45 questions, and just so you guys know, this will be treated like a test then, as far as it'll be retakeable and corrections, the whole 9 yards. And you guys obviously will have a couple weeks to do that when you can during returns and things like that. So there's no reason to be worried and freak out and things like that. All the other opportunities will be presented to you. So anyway, what is it on, right? We are talking about imperialism, World War I, and the Russian Revolution. So it's been a little while since we talked about imperialism, so let's kind of run through a bunch of that material again. I'm going to put it on this screen here. I'll zoom in a little bit. Let's see if I can oh, there we go. Good. Okay, so let me get to the top of this real fast. So imperialism, right? We've talked about this quite a bit. It kind of talked about colonialism and such, and they're very similar themes, right? It's similar thematically, colonialism and imperialism. In fact, in imperialism, you are acquiring colonies, right? But they are a little bit different. This colonial phase is a bit different. It often can be known as new colonialism or new imperialism, essentially, as a result of it being a little bit different, right? So we know that each of these nations in Europe, right, had heavily industrialized and therefore had become pretty successful economically. And often they wanted to increase their success, right? And some of the ways that they realized that they could do this was by expanding through the natural resources of these different areas of the world for their factories, and then also expansion of markets, right, for these manufactured goods that they are then going to be able to then sell. So those are two major ways that they're going to look to expand their economies. So what they settle on is this whole idea of imperialism, right? And imperialism, by definition here, at least the definition that we're using, is the practice of one country extending its control over another country in one of three different ways, right? So the ways that we talked about in particular are controlling the territory of another country, controlling the economy of another country, and also controlling the political system of another country, right? So it can go in any of these three ways, and heck, you can do all of those too. But just by checking one of these boxes, essentially, is an act of imperialism here, right? So imperialism, these European nations, they competed with each other, right? We know that in particular, the two areas of the world are Asia and Africa, and they're going to do this for three different reasons that we talk about anyway here, right? So the first is to obtain those natural resources, which I was just talking about a second ago. You know what, Sydney? I don't think it actually is, so I'll make sure to get this into Google Classroom before the end of the night. That sound good? Right after this. So anyway, so we also have to secure the economic political success of their particular country, right? You have this whole idea of nationalism, so being proud and loyal devotion to your country, thinking your country is the best, the greatest, and therefore wanting to spread that culture onto the rest of the world and into other colonies is one part of it. And also you have this whole idea of mission work, right? So expanding, so culturally, the religious aspect, increasing that into Africa as well, spreading Christianity, the Christianity of Western Europe at the time, right? So we know that it spreads the economic, political, and the religious philosophies of Europe throughout the world, right? And one of the things that we did touch upon when I was going over this for you guys was the size of Africa, right? I think it's really easy to not think of Africa is this enormous place that it actually is. So there's this really cool map, I think, that kind of shows all these different countries that actually fit into the geographic land size of Africa. So when you talk about Africa, Africa is it's absolute the farthest thing from one entity, right? There are tons and tons of different countries today. Back then, you had different ethnic groups and cultural groups and kingdoms and things like that that are going to be now manipulated by the Europeans as they come in. Right? So in 1884, you don't necessarily need to know about the Berlin Conference particularly, but Europe is going to kind of decide that we can do this in Africa, and they're going to kind of meet and talk about how they are going to kind of cordon up, cut up Africa, right? The pie here, the cake, if you will, and divvy it up between them. So the different forms of imperialism, right, to meet the different ways of imperialism and reasons for, right, you have colonies. So in particular, you have direct control of this. It's ruled by, right, ruled by you now. You have protectorates, so it's a country or area that is controlled by a more powerful country, but you're not necessarily completely in direct control as far as politically, and you're not installing a viceroy and things like that necessarily. It's just another level of support. And you also have these spheres of influence, right? It's an area of the world that's going to be dominated by your being there, right? And you have control over certain things, some direct and some indirect control, that you can control those areas as well, right? So you have imperialism in Africa and Asia, and this is where they're going to dominate during the late 1900s, right, and early 20th century here. So they're going to create those colonies, right? So what changes to allow this to significantly have an effect now, and for these Europeans to really dominate like they had not previously, and in particular in Africa. So you have the advent of the machine gun, right, the Maxim gun here, which is going to devastate African and Asian armies in particular. You have the railroad now being created and getting built fully, and it's going to allow resupply into areas of the continent where it previously would not have been. But also you have a way to kind of start to conquer the diseases of Africa with this quinine, which is, it's sort of a drug that's going to kind of counteract the effects of malaria and things. So it'll allow the white Europeans to get into Africa and expand more deeply into the continent where they previously were not able to. So this is what it looked like in 1880, right? You have these different kind of kingdoms and caliphates here from an Islamic Empire standpoint. So you can see all of this, a little bit of Ottoman influence here, a little bit of French influence, a little bit of British influence down here. They're mostly protectorates. There's no real reason to take them completely over. They can kind of indirectly control them. And as also slave trade was declining around the world too. So another reason why the Europeans were less interested in it, right? But we know that with the increase of those inventions that we just talked about, it's going to kind of open things up quite a bit, and this now will be how things look not that long later, right? This is 1913 on the eve of World War I. You do need to kind of match things up with the key over here, but you can see that not much really at all of Africa is going to end up being independent, right? In particular, Ethiopia is going to be one of the only areas in Africa that is going to remain independent of European control. So the Europeans had quickly divided these up. They'd use these other inventions, overwhelmed them and overpowered them to take control, right? So this map here is a little bit different. It's 1914, so this is again right on the eve of World War I. This is global imperialism, so you need to do your best to kind of match up the coloring for the keys here, but the United States had begun its imperialism phase after the war with Spain. You're going to get the Philippines and some Pacific islands as well. They're going to start extending spheres of influence into China. You're going to have United Kingdom all in Africa here, and then India and Australia down here. You can see for yourselves, right, how this global imperialism really had a huge effect at the turn of the 20th century. So much so, one of the things that the Europeans created to try to make this and to be able to easier to exert their control and influence was the creation of the Suez Canal, right? So you have the Suez Canal that gets built between the Red Sea right here and the Mediterranean Sea. It allows a more direct route of travel over to this area of the world in the east because you can now cut through. You can see the Suez Canal actually from a satellite right here, which is pretty cool. And instead of having to go all the way around the huge continent that we were just talking about, Africa. right? So it reduces the distance by nearly half, I guess 43%, and that's a pretty big deal, right? It makes it a whole lot easier for the Europeans to then exert that influence over here instead of having to take months to get all the way around Africa. Perhaps it changes things, right? So the European powers take advantage of that, right? And they begin to carve up Asia in addition to Africa as much as they can anyway. China, you're going to get more spheres of influence in China than direct colonial control like India. India, and then you have French direct control down here in what was known as French Indochina at the time, which was actually Vietnam. This is modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And then you have Japan, right? So Japan and Russian influence as well. The Japanese, they're going to be one of the only areas of the world as well that's going to kind of resist the European colonialism. They are going to, European imperialism, they're going to kind of modernize themselves, and they're going to kind of begin their own imperialistic phase because they see the benefits of it, and they want to be, I suppose you could almost say, a big kid at the table here. At least treated like one in the eyes of the global powers. So anyway, you're going to get resistance to this imperialism, right? You're going to have the Opium Wars in China in particular, where China's going to try to resist the English influence there, and England, to kind of counteract it, is going to push large amounts of opium into the Chinese populace. The Chinese government isn't going to necessarily be able to stop it for them, and sadly for themselves. And they're going to kind of lose control here a bit to the English. You're also going to have the Boxer Rebellion in China, which is really a pretty large event where you have groups in China that are starting to get sick of the European control and even Japanese control after losing what's called the Sino War, the Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese and Japanese. They're getting sick of foreign influence, I guess, to make it really simple here. And by getting sick of foreign influence, they attempt to kind of push out the foreign invaders in their mind, and the international community, instead of kind of giving them their independence here and kind of leaving them alone, they decide to double down and kind of in a friendly manner internationally cooperate. I think there's 8 different countries that send troops to China to kind of squash this rebellion so that ultimately they could continue to manipulate China as much as they wanted over the coming years. So you have the Sepoy Rebellion in India, which is all going to spark off after you have the British East India Trading Company and the English. They effectively give the soldiers who were acting on behalf of the English as a kind of a protectorate and colony, they gave them bullets for these rifles that were greased with cow fat, essentially. And as cows are sacred in Indian culture and Hinduism in some capacity, this is a big no-no, and the Indians get fairly upset about it, and they ultimately rebel. They are going to kind of get put down by the British as well, in a similar capacity to maybe the Opium Wars, and the British are going to kind of exert more control over India, which they considered as the crown jewel of their empire. Crown jewel essentially meaning that effectively it was where a lot of wealth and power and such came from. All these resources and wealth came from there, right? And this will ultimately lead to Indian nationalism, just generally speaking. You're going to get the independence movements following World War I and World War II as a result, right? So we also talked about Japan, and this is an old, I actually fixed this when we talked about it, but this is an older one apparently. It's not the same one I used this year. Japan is an island, right? It's not landlocked, that's just silly. But it is an island, and as a result, you remember it had adopted this kind of policy where they shut themselves off mostly. They're not completely shut off. There are some ways in and out. They have these enclaves, if you remember, where the Dutch kind of traded, and they did trade a little bit with like the Chinese and the Koreans, but ultimately, as far as shutting themselves off to Western powers and Europeans, that's what they mostly did. And they made that decision in like the 1500s. So a couple hundred years goes by, and it's a pretty big deal when all of the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution happens around them, and they're basically not even aware of it. And when the Americans show up with a man named Matthew Perry with warships and cannons, in more modern type of warships than we could think of, and the Japanese are still kind of in the Middle Ages, that concerns them quite a bit, and they decide to essentially modernize as fast as they possibly can. And they do effectively, to make a long story short, and they are able to kind of stem off the Europeans from colonizing them too. And they kind of become a fairly large global power very rapidly here. So that's the end of our imperialism stuff. Hopefully that's, I know I'm talking fairly quickly, so hopefully that's not that much of a problem for you guys. You could always slow this down, I suppose, or watch it as many times as you want, but anyway, trying to get through this as efficiently as possible here. So that is our imperialism in a nutshell. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to post it in the chat. And if you give me a minute here, I'm going to get the other stuff up as well. So give me 1 second. So open this. All right, I'm gonna try something too, just for kicks here. Let's see if this caption thing works. I hear it does. I'm gonna move myself on the screen to take advantage of those captions. But anyway, so here is World War I, right? So if you remember, there we go. All right. So World War I, we know, is the first war in human history that's going to involve large amounts of people and countries, and people from all over the world, right? So you have people from Europe and Asia and Africa and Australia and Americans all fighting in this world war, right? Which is why it's called a world war, after the fact anyway. And at the time, it was actually known as the Great War. So anyway, right, we know the underlying causes of the war. We've talked about it numerous times. If you can remember the acronym MAIN, you should be able to remember most of these, right? So going down the list, main, right, we have militarism is the first piece of this puzzle as far as the underlying causes of the war. You have the alliance system following that, right? And the different competing factions and camps here, countries taking sides with each other, is what's going to make this evolve very quickly into a large-scale conflict. From the alliance system, you have the I, which is imperialism, right? And that imperialism is really going to also cause conflict, right? It's going to cause tension, and it's going to kind of help bring forth that powder keg effect that we talked about, so when the assassination happens, that is essentially it blows up, right? The powder keg. And the last piece is that nationalism, right? Nationalism, this extreme loyalty to your country, is a really important thing to think about, right? So that people being so prideful of their countries ultimately is what's going to lead to a war, right? It allows people to buy in completely into these wars. Their country is right as far as they're concerned, that they can't do any wrong, and ultimately they're going to get a fight, right? And all of these things combined makes this into a much larger war here. Okay, so we have our different sides, right? The big three on two different sides, right? You have the Triple Entente. The French, right? The word Entente is how you can kind of remember that. It also can be known as the Allies, and they're really known as that more during World War II. But anyway, you have the French, the British, and the Russians. You're going to have the United States join in a bit later for all sorts of reasons, which you'll learn more about next year, when Russia leaves after the Russian Revolution. So we also have the Central Powers, right? So the Central Powers in this case are the Germans, right? The Austria-Hungarians and the Ottomans, right? And you have other small regional players too, but those are the big three, and I guess four on the one side, from those particular alliances anyway. Okay, so hopefully you got those down. So we talked about the major events, right? And as far as Virginia is concerned, you don't really need to know too many of these events. So let's kind of highlight a couple anyway. So you have the assassination of Austria's Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo, and that's the spark that lights the powder keg, right, that we were talking about. So that happens, right? And the world plunges into war. After all, the alliance system kicks in, and you have failures of diplomacy, and the Germans decide that they need to attack if they're going to have any hope of avoiding a two-front war. And that's what gets this whole thing going, right? We do know that the United States is going to enter the war as well in 1917. The Russians are going to leave it in 1917 as a result of the Russian Revolution. So those are the big events that Virginia actually asked you to know, right? So here is a map, just a quick, easy one anyway, of the different powers here, right? So you have the Allies' powers here, surrounding the central powers of the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans, kind of more directly in the middle here. Right, this gray is meant to be neutral. Spain, most of Africa here, besides sending some troops from colony standpoint. And you have Norway and Sweden up here. Do not really get into the fight at all. Belgium was supposed to be neutral, but when Germany goes through Belgium, the Belgians kind of don't like that too much, violating the neutrality, and the Belgians attack the Germans as they go through, right? So this is what it kind of looks like on a global stance here. The Americans are going to kind of, and the colonies are going to get involved with the this is the Allied colonies in green, and you have the Central Powers colonies here, I guess, in orange, and with the Central Powers. So as far as the major leaders you should familiarize yourself with, you have Kaiser Wilhelm. Kaiser Wilhelm was the German emperor. Hopefully you can kind of recognize that name as German. You have Tsar Nicholas II, right? And he is the emperor of Russia, right? This is a kind of a pushback almost to absolute monarchy, right? That you have more or less absolute power. You do not need to know who the neutral powers are, Brigitte, but I'm just pointing them out to you. So anyway, you have Tsar Nicholas is the emperor of Russia. That's kind of the kickback to that absolute power days that we were talking about. You're going to have a man named Vladimir Lenin lead the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and he will take over as the leader of the Soviet Union when they are successful in their revolution. Then lastly, you here have Woodrow Wilson, right? Woodrow Wilson is the president of the United States during the time period, and he is also going to be influential with his push of the 14 points, which the main point that's going to be adopted from that anyway is the whole idea of the League of Nations, right? So, technologies we talked a lot about too, and hopefully you remember this from our little activity, but we talked about the machine guns, right, as being a huge part. You're going to have these famous charges, basically, that are meaningless, right? They're just putting tons and tons of men into this fight and charge, and ultimately the machine guns are just mowing them down. It's just a kind of a pointless waste of life, and it takes a long time for the different sides and the generals to kind of adapt and adopt more of a modern fighting style in comparison to the fighting styles that they were used to from the previous century, essentially. You have poison gas is going to change the game quite a bit as well. You have the rise of tanks as a means of trying to avoid artillery, but also be able to kind of navigate no man's land a little bit in the middle between the different trenches. And you also have airplanes going to be coming in as well. The beginning of the war, they're going to look very different than the end of the war too, as far as the airplanes go. You have submarines, right? And submarines are going to really be a big deal as well. And the submarines in particular, the Germans have quite a few of them. They're known as U-boats. And the U-boats and the unrestricted submarine warfare is going to be one of the main reasons the Americans are going to enter the war. It's not the only reason, but it is one of the main reasons for sure. So, and we also talked about the whole idea of trench warfare, right? These long, hard fighting, fought battles in these trenches, dug out in the ground. We talked about the experiences of the men in the trenches quite a bit, so hopefully you remember that. I'm not going to necessarily go into any more detail than that right now. So here's an airplane, here's a tank, although this is a bit later of a version of a tank. This is more of a World War I version of a tank right here. When I post you have the access to these PowerPoints anyway, but you can watch these videos if you so chose again. The fighting is going to end ultimately in 1918. You're going to get an end to the fighting. An armistice is going to be declared in the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918 after the Americans get involved. The Americans, they are going to, it's basically like adding a whole new person here in the 15th round of a boxing match. The Americans are undoubtedly going to kind of help tip the balance in the favor of the Allies for sure, even though they didn't do the bulk of the fighting, as they only got involved here late in the game. The French took the biggest blow of all the different Allied powers for sure. But anyway, so we have the armistice that happens on 11/11, and that is ultimately why we celebrate Veterans Day on the 11th of November. It was originally Armistice Day, then it became Veterans Day after we celebrate the rest of the veterans as well. So anyway, the war is going to end with the Treaty of Versailles that we talked about quite a bit, that we did a whole packet on by the Germans, right? So the Treaty of Versailles, just to bring it down to a small little bit of information here, right? You have the war guilt clause by the Germans, right? The Allies take the German land, right? In particular, you have this Alsace and Lorraine. It's given to France, where they had taken it previously in the Franco-Prussian War. You're going to have German colonies kind of broken up as well and given to the Allied powers. Okay, so that's Alsace-Lorraine right here. It's kind of this in-between French and German, and they both argue kind of which group, whose it is. So we know that the Allies placed limits on German military strength, right? Reparations were forced on Germany. It's quite a bit of money. We did the inflation calculator. It's essentially the equivalent of about $1 trillion today being forced to pay by the Germans to the Allied powers here. It's quite a lot. And it's going to ultimately establish a whole new map of Europe, right? And that's a pretty big deal. So you also have Woodrow Wilson's contribution, right? This whole idea of the League of Nations that they are going to adopt, even though they don't really adopt much of the rest of the 14 points. And the League of Nations will be born as a means of trying to have things diplomatically solved before it were to get into a large war like this. I'll give you a hint. It didn't work, right? Spoilers much, I guess. So anyway, we have the outcomes of the war, right? We have a bunch of empires that are ended, right? The Russian Imperial Empire is no more. They will fall to the communists and the Soviets, right? The Bolshevik Revolution. The Ottoman Empire, being on the wrong side, is going to kind of get cordoned up, divvied up by the Allied powers here, and they're going to redraw many of the lines that we are familiar with in the Middle East right now. You're going to have the German Empire also kind of, it's no more, right? You're going to have Germany and such afterwards, and they will obviously bring their... We know what happens with Germany, and we'll be talking more about that over the next coming weeks. But anyway, you also have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? So we start World War I as this era where you actually have kings, right? And by the end of World War I, that's going to kind of disappear. You're going to have this whole idea of absolute monarchs really kind of coming to an end around this time period for the most part around the world. Not all the places, I suppose, but in most of the European powers anyway. And we also know that the colonies, their participation in the war, they are going to begin to look and demand independence for themselves as well. Right? So that about sums up World War I. Again, we're moving pretty rapidly here, so hopefully you've been following along. And at this point, I feel like it is probably a perfect time to say what the extra credit question is going to be. So the extra credit question is going to be, and I'm going to kind of turn off the captions here for a moment so it doesn't spell it out for the people if they're just trying to kind of look through. But basically, I am going, this past weekend, I was up in, so the question is, where was I this weekend? And ultimately, where is Ms. Kipperman going to be for all of next week? So I personally was in New York City this weekend for the track and field indoor nationals, which I think is pretty cool. So if you just say New York when I ask the question, you'll be good. And Mrs. Kipperman will actually be in London and Scotland, I believe, for the next week. Lucky her, right? So if you know those two, then you shall be good, right? And I also know how many people are watching right now. So I'm a little suspicious of people talking to friends. So what I'm going to say is that if more people than what I kind of expect get the extra credit right, then I don't know if we're going to get it to anybody. So I will make a call on that after the test. But I'm pretty sure people have been cheating about that lately the last couple times. So don't do yourself a favor and don't tell people that weren't here. So anyway, with that said, let's go into our last topic, the Russian Revolution, right now. So give me a second to change over the different notes, please, if you don't mind. Nope, I need to, there we go. All right. Alright, just one more minute here. I just lost it. Where is it? I just had it. That's Russian Revolution. That's not right. Where did it go? I just had it. There it is. Alright, there we go. So let's do this, right? I'll turn the captions on too. I don't know if they're helpful to anybody, but what the heck, it's kind of cool that it can read me that well. Although I've seen a couple mistakes anyway. Okay, this is, yeah. All right, the Russian Revolution, part 2, right here from World War I anyway. So, Mrs. Kipperman, I know, talked about the differences in alphabets anyway. You have it's the Cyrillic alphabet in Russian, right? So, we know that there were sharp class divisions between the nobility and peasants in Russia, right? This is not uncommon. We also know that this is fairly common throughout Europe, right? So, Russia isn't necessarily the exception here. Right? So the Tsar himself, the king, the emperor, whatever you want to call him, is pretty conservative, right? Unchanging, and did not resolve the complaints of the peasants and workers, right? So effectively, you're going to have this event in 1905 known as Bloody Sunday, where you're going to have 200,000 workers bringing a petition for better working conditions to the palace, and ultimately they kind of just ignore them. Not really ignore them, actually. They kind of just say whatever, and they're going to shoot into the crowd, killing several hundreds of these people. It's Bloody Sunday for a reason, but you can imagine what kind of attitude and how these people are going to feel about their government if they're just being shot at, essentially, by the king and the palace people. They're going to be pretty pissed off if you imagine. I'm also just speaking to myself here. I'm finding it funny how I'm watching numbers dip after I give out the extra credit answers on the video, so I guess that's it. But anyway, all right, moving forward here, right? We know that the peasants ultimately are landless, and they are going to want more, as much as they can, right? You still kind of have this serfdom a little bit here, right? We also know that we have the industrialization, so the workers are feeling that they're not necessarily being treated fairly, and when you also get a humiliating loss of kind of a European power losing to Japan, which they didn't necessarily see as a global power, when you add all of these different kind of things going together, it's not really a good time to be a Russian. Okay, so this is just Tsar Nicholas right here. Pretty handsome dude, if I do say so myself. That's a pretty sweet mustache. I'm kind of jealous. But anyway, so you have arguably the incompetence of Tsar Nicholas II kind of leading to the Russian Revolution, right? So between military defeats, right, not being nearly trained as well as the German military, when World War I breaks out, the Germans, they're doing better than the Russians, right? You're going to lead to very high Russian casualties. Many Russian soldiers, they're not necessarily well equipped for this, and ultimately things don't go well for the Russians. Your prices are going to go up. You're going to have inflation going up during the war, demand for higher wages and things like that as a result, but they're not being met by the workers. And just again, all in all, the 1900 to 1920 is really not a good time to be Russian. And I suppose if you're super anti-communist too, then it's not going to be a good time to be a Russian for a very long time starting this, right? So you have this loss of morale that leads to violence, right, and breaking out over all of this, right? So between the military defeats, you have famine going on in Russia and bread shortages. The troops are going to mutiny, and they're going to refuse to fire on civilians in Moscow and St. Petersburg while this is going on. And eventually, the Tsar is going to he's going to say enough's enough. You guys want change, and I guess I can't help you guys. And on some level, he's going to do the right thing, and he's going to abdicate. So he's actually going to say, I'm good. You guys can figure out what you're going to do, but I'm going to give up my power in March 1917, figuring he's incapable of solving these problems, right? So Mrs. Kipperman also talked about Rasputin, who was this kind of religious advisor to the Tsar's family. He had a pretty strong relationship with the Tsar's wife, and who kind of listened to a lot of the things that he said, right? And this weird circumstance and situation where he was able to kind of heal the their child's hemophilia, right? Which is this rare blood disease, essentially, and so the mother really kind of holds this guy in a high regard, and he's going to be, just to keep a long story short, sorry, I'm just trying to read comments here too at the same time, so sorry for that little lurch there. But anyway, so he is ultimately going to be killed by some Russian nobles. In a long story short, Mrs. Kipperman told you the whole story though. But look at that dude; that is quite the beard, for sure. So he gets himself into the high circle of the Russian nobility here for a little while, right? So we are going to now get back to the story where you have the Tsar abdicating, right? So after the Tsar abdicates, the people come together to try to form some sort of government, right? You're going to have a provisional government that is put together called the Duma, that it rules for, I guess that's about 8 months, right? Between March, I guess 9 months, or 7 months, sorry, between March and October. But it kind of falls apart when you have Vladimir Lenin leading the Bolshevik charge, and the Communist Revolution really taking off here now at this point, when the provisional government is ineffective in kind of dealing with a lot of the issues that was going on in Russia. So you have, led by Lenin, his slogan is peace, land, and bread, and he overthrows this provisional government. You're going to get a pretty large civil war between these different powers in Russia as well, and the Bolsheviks, we do know, are going to kind of prevail, right? So within days of kind of taking full control here, you're going to have Lenin ordering farmland given to the peasants, right, and factories given to the workers. You're going to get what's called this Treaty of I can't say the Russian, but you're going to get a truce with the Germans, giving up some territory, but getting them out of the war, and ultimately you have the Bolsheviks, right? And they come in and they don't want any chance of Tsar Nicholas trying to undo whatever they've done, and they're going to have him and his entire family murdered, right? It's kind of this pretty gruesome story, for sure. So we have this Russian Civil War. Some people are pretty upset with the Bolshevik actions, which we are just talking about. We're going to get what's called the White Army and the Red Army. You're going to have Leon Trotsky leading the Red Army to victory, where you're right, this is a successful communist revolution here. You're going to have the establishment of the communist state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, to let you know what the USSR stands for, or just shortened down to the Soviet Union, where Vladimir Lenin will become the leader. You're going to have Lenin issuing what's called the New Economic Policy, which does allow for some private property, kind of reneges on the whole straight-up communist thing here for a little while, kind of as a appeasing, I guess, some of the wealthier and noble type people here in Russia. Lenin's going to die in 1924, and you're going to have a bit of a power struggle between Joseph Stalin and Trotsky, where Joseph Stalin will become the man in charge. So this is Vladimir Lenin right here. His body is on display, which is kind of a little creepy, but here he is. Anyway, so that's kind of it in a nutshell. So yeah. So if you have any questions about it, I know we kind of went pretty quickly, although we went as quickly as we can and still went 40 minutes here. So thank you for showing up. Hopefully you guys got the extra credit answers. And if you didn't, you can, I guess, go find it. Easter egg hunt. Anyway, so hope you guys study and hope you guys do well.